You think you know the ending of this tragedy. The script seems almost too familiar. A blindingly bright 80s child star spirals into a cliché of parties, erratic behavior, and addiction, finally extinguishing himself with a massive overdose. That is what the headline screamed in 2010. But it is a lie. The truth about Corey Haim's death is darker, crueler, and far more infuriating than any movie he ever starred in. The Lost Boys icon did not die from a recreational high. He died of pneumonia and a heart enlarged by sorrow, a victim of a medical system that left him to drown in his own lungs simply because he carried the stigma of an addict. But the real autopsy goes deeper than his final breath. It traces back to 1986, to a 14-year-old boy with a wolf pack of predators circling him. It reveals a system that groomed a prodigy, weaponized his trauma to keep the cameras rolling, and then discarded him the moment he shattered. From the dazzling heights of teen idolatry to the shadowed hotel rooms where his soul was stolen, this is an investigation into how the entertainment industry cannibalizes its own children. It is time to dismantle the junkie label and witness the terrifying reality of a boy who was killed long before his heart stopped beating. Here is the devastating true story of what actually happened to Corey Haim. Born in Toronto in 1971, Corey Haim was an anomaly in the world of child stars. Most children who end up in front of the camera are propelled there by a natural, irrepressible exhibitionism. The kid who dances on the table at Thanksgiving, the class clown who demands attention. Corey was the opposite. He was a creature of profound silence and sensitivity. He was painfully shy, the kind of child who hid behind his mother's legs when strangers approached, the kind of boy who lived in his own internal world. In a twist of irony that feels almost literary in its cruelty, his mother, Judy Haim, enrolled him in drama classes, not because she saw a star, but because she saw a problem. She wanted to fix his shyness. She wanted to draw him out of his shell. It was a decision born of love and concern, a desire to help her son navigate the world with more confidence. She could not have known that by pushing him into the light, she was walking him directly into the mouth of a beast that feeds on the vulnerable. The cure for his shyness would eventually become the poison that killed him. His talent, however, was not manufactured. It was innate, raw, and terrifyingly real. When Corey Haim acted, he didn't pretend, he simply was. He possessed a level of emotional transparency that seasoned method actors spend decades trying to achieve. The camera, which is a ruthless lie detector, fell in love with him instantly. It captured the hesitation in his voice, the flicker of fear in his eyes, the genuine sweetness that couldn't be faked. By the time he was cast in the 1986 film Lucas, he was already being hailed as a prodigy. Watch Lucas today, and you are not watching a teen movie. You are watching a masterclass in vulnerability. Haim played the titular character, a socially awkward intellectual outcast with such devastating authenticity that the legendary film critic Roger Ebert was moved to predict greatness. Ebert didn't compare Haim to the other teen idols of the day. He compared him to the titans of the craft. He saw in this 14-year-old boy the potential of a young Robert De Niro or Al Pacino. The industry saw it too. They saw a boy who could make the audience cry with a single look. They saw a gold mine, but they also saw something else. A boy without a father figure, a boy eager to please, a boy who was desperate for validation. They saw prey. The transition from respected young actor to global commodity happened with the speed of a car crash. In 1987, director Joel Schumacher cast Haim in The Lost Boys. If Lucas was the film that proved his talent, The Lost Boys was the film that stole his soul. It was a vampire movie that served as a metaphor for the eternal youth and dangerous seduction of Hollywood itself. On set, Corey Haim met Corey Feldman, and the binary star system of the two Coreys was born. They were the kings of the world. They were young, they were beautiful, and they were rich. They were given the keys to the kingdom, allowed to run wild through the playgrounds of the adult world before they were old enough to shave. The media painted their lives as a nonstop fantasy of parties, girls, and fun. But the reality was a frantic, unsupervised chaos. They were children living in hotels, surrounded by yes men, surrounded by enablers, surrounded by adults who were financially dependent on their ability to keep working, keep smiling, and keep earning. It was during this period, the era of his greatest visibility, that the darkness descended. The open secret of Hollywood, the cancer that had been metastasizing in the industry for decades, found Corey Haim. But the price of this global adulation was a debt no child should ever have to pay. Behind the bedroom posters and the screaming fans, a silent chemical storm was beginning to gather, intended to numb a pain that had no name. Powerful narcotics weren't just substances to Corey, they were medicine for a wound that no doctor would acknowledge. The industry that had broken him was more than happy to supply the bandage. Dealers were allowed onto sets. Enablers looked the other way. As long as he could hit his mark and say his lines, nobody cared what he put up his nose or swallowed to get through the day. The wolf pack in the industry at large protected their investment by keeping him functional, even if functional meant high. By the time License to Drive and Dream a Little Dream were released in the late 80s, the damage was becoming visible. The angelic face was starting to look puffy. The eyes were glazed. The behavior was erratic. And this is where the second betrayal occurred. The same industry that had abused him, the same industry that had looked the other way while he was groomed and drugged, suddenly decided to develop a conscience, not to save him, but to condemn him. The narrative shifted. Corey Haim was no longer the golden boy. He was difficult. He was unprofessional. He was a junkie. The producers who had exploited his youth now shunned his adulthood. The phone stopped ringing. The scripts stopped coming. At the age of 18, when his adult life should have been beginning, Corey Haim was effectively blacklisted. He was cast out into the wilderness of the 1990s, a lost boy in the truest sense. He carried the stigma of the fallen child star, a label that invites mockery rather than empathy. The public watched his decline with a morbid fascination, unaware that they were witnessing the slow-motion aftermath of a crime scene. He was left to navigate the wreckage of his life with no education, no life skills, and a severe addiction that was deeply rooted in unresolved trauma. He went from being the breadwinner for his family, the boy who bought the houses and the cars, to a liability. The pressure was immense. He wasn't just fighting for his sobriety, he was fighting for his dignity in a world that had decided he was a joke. The relationship with Corey Feldman during these years was a complex tapestry of brotherhood and codependency. They were the only two people on earth who truly understood what it meant to be the two Coreys. They shared the scars of the same battlefield. But while Feldman managed to build walls and eventually find a path to a different kind of survival, Haim remained an open wound. He wore his heart and his trauma on his sleeve. He was desperate for a comeback, not just for the money, but for the validation. He needed to know that he still mattered. He needed to know that he wasn't just a piece of trash that had been used up and thrown away. But Hollywood is not in the business of redemption. It is in the business of replacement. And Corey Haim had been replaced by the next generation of fresh-faced boys who had no idea what was waiting for them in the dark. As the new millennium approached, Corey Haim was living in a state of suspended animation. He was trapped in the 80s, trapped in the trauma of his adolescence, and trapped in a cycle of relapse and recovery that was fueled by a pain too deep to name. The world saw a mess. They saw a guy selling his hair on eBay. They saw a reality TV train wreck. But if they had looked closer, they would have seen a boy who was still waiting for someone to save him. A boy who was still waiting for the director to yell "cut" so he could go home. But the scene never ended. The camera never really stopped rolling. And the wolf pack remained in the shadows, silent and unpunished, while their victim slowly suffocated in the light of day. The stage was set for the final act, not of an overdose, but of a tragedy far more mundane and far more cruel. If the 1980s were the party that Corey Haim was invited to host, the 1990s were the hangover that he was left to clean up alone. As the decade turned, the cultural landscape shifted violently. The neon optimism of the Reagan era dissolved into the flannel-clad cynicism of the grunge movement. Hollywood, always eager to discard yesterday's fashion, decided that the teen heartthrob archetype was obsolete. They wanted gritty. They wanted authentic. They wanted angst. Corey Haim, with his crooked smile and his association with bubblegum pop culture, was suddenly a relic at the age of 20. The phone, which had rung incessantly for 5 years, went silent. It is a silence that drives actors mad, a void where validation used to live. For Corey, this professional abandonment was not just a career setback. It was a confirmation of his deepest fears. The industry that had groomed him, used him, and abused him had now decided he was disposable. The descent into the wilderness years was not a straight line. It was a slow, agonizing spiral of humiliation broadcast to a public that had lost its capacity for empathy. By 1997, the boy who had once commanded six-figure salaries filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The documents revealed a tragedy of financial mismanagement and exploitation. He listed debts totaling over $200,000 against assets that were virtually non-existent. He owned a 1987 BMW, a small pension, and little else. The millions he had generated for the studios had evaporated, siphoned off by managers, lost to the high cost of addiction, and spent on the desperate maintenance of a lifestyle he could no longer afford. He was 25 years old, and he was destitute. This poverty was not the romanticized, starving artist struggle. It was gritty, desperate, and public. Without the protective bubble of fame, Corey was exposed to the cruelty of the real world. He moved from luxury hotels to transient apartments. He was dependent on the charity of friends and the unwavering, if complicated, support of his mother, Judy. The addiction, which had started as a way to numb the trauma of sexual abuse, had now become a physical necessity. His body, dependent on prescription pharmaceuticals to function, began to betray him. The angelic face that had launched 1,000 crushes became puffy and bloated. His teeth, ravaged by years of neglect and drug use, began to rot. In the mid-2000s, the rise of the internet created a new digital coliseum for his suffering. Paparazzi and gossip blogs, hungry for content, hunted him down. They didn't want photos of him working. They wanted photos of him failing. They snapped pictures of fat Corey, mocking his weight gain. They ridiculed his disheveled appearance. He became a punchline on late-night talk shows, a "where are they now" cautionary tale. The world looked at a man who was clearly suffering from profound PTSD and a severe medical condition, addiction, and they laughed. They laughed because it was easier than asking why a 30-year-old man looked so broken. They laughed because it absolved them of the guilt of having consumed his childhood. In a desperate bid for relevance and solvency, Corey returned to the only well he knew, the dynamic with Corey Feldman. In 2007, the reality show The Two Coreys premiered on A&E. It was billed as a reunion, a comeback vehicle, a buddy comedy about two grown-up child stars living together. But to the discerning eye, it was a tragedy filmed in high definition. The show highlighted the stark divergence in their paths. Feldman was sober, married, and attempting to impose structure on his life. Haim was chaotic, emotional, and visibly struggling. The cameras captured the friction, the arguments, and the heartbreaking moments where Haim's addiction sabotaged his opportunities. The show was meant to redeem him. Instead, it often exploited him. It turned his struggle for sobriety into a plot point. It turned his trauma into content. The tension culminated in a public falling out, with Feldman famously refusing to speak to Haim until he got sober. It was tough love broadcast for ratings. For Corey Haim, who was desperate for connection and brotherhood, this rejection, however well-intentioned by Feldman, was a devastating blow. He felt abandoned by his other half. The show ended, the cameras packed up, and Corey was once again left alone in the silence. But this time, he had burned his last bridge. The depth of his desperation reached its nadir in 2001 in an incident that stands as one of the most heartbreaking symbols of celebrity decay. Broke, hungry, and terrified of losing his apartment, Corey Haim logged onto eBay. He didn't have memorabilia to sell. He didn't have a script or a costume. He listed his own hair. When that didn't generate enough interest, he tried to sell his own tooth. It was an act of grotesque survivalism, a man literally selling pieces of himself to strangers to pay the rent. eBay pulled the auction, citing policies against the sale of human body parts, but the headline went global. Corey Haim sells tooth. The world scoffed. They called him pathetic. They didn't see a human being in the throes of a survival crisis. They seen a sideshow freak. This was the boy who had been compared to Al Pacino. This was the boy who had been the Prince of Hollywood. Now he was selling his molars to the highest bidder. By early 2010, Corey Haim was living with his mother in a small apartment at the Oakwood complex in Burbank. The Oakwood is a transient place, a way station for actors coming to LA for pilot season, and a landing pad for those who have nowhere else to go. It is a place of temporary dreams and permanent purgatory. Corey was 38 years old. He was broke, he was unemployable, and he was sick. The narrative that Corey Haim was partying in his final days is a lie that needs to be dismantled. He wasn't partying, he was dying. His body was failing. He had developed an enlarged heart, hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a condition likely exacerbated by years of stress and past drug use, but also a genetic vulnerability. His immune system was shot. He was in constant chronic pain. This leads us to the red herring of the investigation, the phenomenon known as doctor shopping. In the weeks leading up to his death, police records would later show that Corey had visited 7 different doctors and 7 different pharmacies. He had obtained 553 prescription pills in just 32 days. The list included Valium, Vicodin, Soma, and Halcyon. When these numbers were released after his death, they were presented as the smoking gun. 553 pills. The number was repeated on every news channel. It was proof, they said, that he was a junkie out of control, binging himself to death. But context is everything. Corey Haim was a man with no health insurance. He had no primary care physician who knew his history. He was navigating a fractured American healthcare system the only way a poor, desperate addict knew how. He was in pain, legitimate physical pain from a deteriorating body, and he was terrified. He went to urgent cares and clinics seeking relief. Did he manipulate the system to get drugs? Yes. Was he addicted? Yes, but was he doing this to have a wild party? No. He was self-medicating a body that was shutting down. He was trying to treat symptoms that no one was bothering to diagnose correctly. He was gathering an arsenal of pills not to kill himself, but to numb the agony of living in a body that was slowly suffocating him. In the days leading up to March 10th, 2010, Corey fell ill. It started as flu-like symptoms. He was weak, he had a fever, he was coughing. His mother, Judy, did what she could. She cared for him in their small apartment. She made him soup. She watched over him. They thought it was just a bad flu. A doctor had seen him days earlier and diagnosed it as such, perhaps distracted by the addict label on his chart, missing the fluid building up in his lungs. This is the silent killer of the poor and the stigmatized. Medical negligence born of bias. When a known addict walks into a clinic complaining of pain or sickness, they are often treated as drug seekers first and patients second. The stethoscope doesn't listen as closely. The X-ray isn't ordered as quickly. On the night of March 9th, Corey was restless. He wandered the apartment delirious with fever. He took his medications, the Soma, the Valium, hoping to sleep. He didn't know that his lungs were filling with fluid, that he was drowning on dry land. He didn't know that his enlarged heart was struggling to pump blood through his congested system. Around midnight, he collapsed in the bedroom. He wasn't convulsing from an overdose. He was weak. He looked at his mother, his eyes filled with the fear of a little boy who knows something is terribly wrong. His last words were not a rock star's exit line. They were a plea. "Mom," he whispered, "I think I'm going to die." And then, "I can't breathe." Judy Haim called 911. The panic in her voice on the recording is the sound of a mother watching her worst nightmare materialize. The paramedics arrived at the Oakwood apartments. They worked on him. They loaded him into the ambulance. They raced to Providence St. Joseph Medical Center, the same hospital that serves the studios that had made him a star. But it was too late. At 2:15 a.m. on March 10th, 2010, Corey Haim was pronounced dead. The machinery of the media did not wait for the sun to rise. By the time the morning news shows went on air, the verdict had been delivered. Corey Haim dead at 38. Suspected overdose. Child star tragedy. The narrative was set in stone before the body was even cold. The Attorney General of California, Jerry Brown, saw an opportunity for political capital. He held a press conference, waiving the report of the 553 pills, calling Corey the poster child for prescription drug abuse. He used a dead man's tragedy to launch a crackdown on prescription fraud. He painted Corey as a criminal, a warning, a statistic. For weeks, the world believed this lie. They believed Corey Haim had swallowed a handful of pills and partied his way into the grave. They shook their heads and said, "We saw it coming." They felt superior. They felt justified in their judgment. But they were wrong. They were all wrong. When the Los Angeles County coroner finally finished the toxicology report and the autopsy, the results were a quiet bombshell that the noisy world largely ignored. There were no illegal drugs in Corey Haim's system, no heroin, no cocaine, no crack. The levels of prescription drugs, the Valium, the Soma, the Halcyon, were present, but they were low. They were consistent with therapeutic use. They were not at lethal levels. Corey Haim did not overdose. The coroner listed the cause of death as diffuse alveolar damage and pneumonia, with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy as a contributing factor. In plain English, Corey Haim died of pneumonia. He had a massive lung infection that prevented oxygen from getting to his blood, and his weak, enlarged heart couldn't handle the strain. He didn't die from a high. He died because he was sick. He died because he was a poor man with a bad heart and a chest and feet infection who was treated with sedatives instead of antibiotics. The sedatives he was prescribed, the ones the Attorney General waved around as proof of his depravity, actually contributed to his death, but not because of an overdose. Sedatives suppress respiration. When you give a man with pneumonia a respiratory depressant, you are essentially helping the disease kill him. The medical system had looked at an addict and prescribed pills to shut him up rather than looking at a patient and prescribing antibiotics to heal him. The tragedy of Corey Haim's death is not that he relapsed. It is that he died of a 19th century disease in 21st century Los Angeles because his reputation preceded him. If he had been a clean-cut businessman with insurance, he would have been given a chest x-ray, put on a course of antibiotics, and sent home to recover. But because he was Corey Haim, the junkie child star, his symptoms were misread, his pain was dismissed, and he was sent home to die. The revelation of the autopsy results did not generate the same headlines as his death. The world had already moved on. The correction ran on page 6. The apology never came. The industry that had blacklisted him did not rush to correct the record. In fact, they delivered one final crushing insult. At the Academy Awards that year, held just weeks after his death, the In Memoriam segment aired. It is the moment where Hollywood honors its dead, a montage of the actors, directors, and writers who passed away that year. Millions watched, waiting to see Corey's face. He had starred in some of the most iconic films of the 80s. He was a part of cinema history. But as the montage played, face after face appeared, and then it ended. Corey Haim was not included. He was omitted. It was a deliberate erasure. The Academy claimed it was due to time constraints and that he wasn't primarily known for his film work in recent years. But the message was clear. You do not belong to us anymore. You are an embarrassment. We do not mourn you. This erasure was the final nail in the coffin of his dignity. Yet to truly understand the tragedy of Corey Haim, one must look past the snub, past the movies, and look at his skin. On his arm, Corey had a tattoo. It was a simple phrase, etched in black ink, that he looked at every day in the mirror. It read, "Thou shalt not fall." For years, people interpreted this as a boast, a declaration of arrogance from a young star who thought he was invincible. But in the context of what we now know about his life, the rape at 14, the relentless grooming, the pressure to support his family, the blacklisting, the tattoo takes on a heartbreaking new meaning. It wasn't a boast, it was a prayer. It was a desperate command to himself. It was a mantra etched into the flesh of a boy who felt himself slipping over the edge every single day. Thou shalt not fall. He was trying to hold himself up when the entire world was trying to push him down. But the sad, brutal truth is that Corey did fall. He didn't fall because he was weak. He didn't fall because he lacked talent or will. He fell because the ground beneath him was a trapdoor. He was pushed by a mother who, however well-intentioned, placed him in the path of predators to cure his shyness. He was pushed by the wolf pack, the men who saw a vulnerable boy without a father and decided he was theirs to take. He was pushed by the producers who handed him drugs to keep him working when he was too traumatized to function. He was pushed by the doctors who saw a junkie instead of a dying patient. And finally, he was pushed by us, the audience who laughed at his reality show, who mocked his appearance, who bought the tabloids, and who turned his pain into a punchline. The legacy of Corey Haim is not found in the vampire caves of the Lost Boys or the high school hallways of Lucas. It is found in the dark, uncomfortable conversations we are finally starting to have about the cost of fame. He is the ghost at the banquet. He is the warning that we ignored for too long. His life serves as a grim autopsy of the teen idol machine. We like our child stars to be cute, precocious, and entertaining. We want them to dance for us. But when the trauma of that performance breaks them, when they grow up into scarred, complicated, struggling adults, we recoil. We discard them like broken toys. Corey Haim was the canary in the coal mine. His stories of abuse, dismissed in the 90s as the rantings of a washed-up addict, have now been validated by the #MeToo movement and the brave testimony of other survivors. We now know that he wasn't lying. We now know that the wolf pack was real. We now know that the monsters in The Lost Boys were not the vampires on the screen, but the men standing behind the cameras. In the end, Corey Haim died as he had lived in his final years, a boy interrupting the silence, asking to be seen, asking to be saved, and being met with indifference. He died gasping for air in a small apartment, holding on to his mother, the only constant in a life of variables. He didn't die the way we thought. He didn't die chasing a high. He died because his heart, a heart that had been broken, exploited, enlarged, and exhausted, finally gave up the fight. We cannot bring him back. We cannot give him the childhood he was owed. We cannot undo the abuse. But we can do one thing. We can rewrite the ending. We can strip away the junkie label and replace it with the truth. We can remember him not as a cautionary tale of excess, but as a talented, sensitive soul who was destroyed by the very thing he loved. We can look at his image, the crooked smile, the bright eyes, and recognize the immense courage it took for him to survive as long as he did. Corey Haim was a lost boy who never found his way home, not because he didn't try, but because the map he was given was a lie. And as long as Hollywood continues to churn out child stars, grinding them into dust for our entertainment, his ghost will be watching, pointing to the ink on his arm, whispering the warning that nobody heard until it was too late. Thou shalt not fall. But we let him fall. And that is the tragedy that no amount of applause can ever drown out.